The first sentence of her journal was enough to damn a soul. I called him my servant so the world would never know he was my son. Those 9 words survived the fire that erased everything else, the house, the portraits, even her name on the family Bible. They are all that remain of Evelyn Ashford, mistress of Willow Creek Plantation, and the lie that devoured her life. If that single line already sends a chill down your spine, pause right here and subscribe. This channel brings you the histories people tried to hide, the stories that still whisper beneath old foundations and overgrown graves. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. Maybe you've driven the back roads of Virginia without realizing whose shame still sleeps under that soil. Now, close your eyes and go back with me. It's the winter of 1846. Snow dusts the cotton fields, the river is locked in ice, and the world is ruled by silence. Inside the great house at Willow Creek, a young widow walks through candlelight and shadow. Her mourning dress rustles against marble floors. Her reflection glides beside her like a ghost. The neighbors say she's composed, even elegant. They don't see the fear that keeps her awake when the wind scratches the shutters. Because upstairs, behind a locked nursery door, lies the secret that will one day burn her name from every ledger in Virginia. She hears it each night, the faint rhythm of a child's breathing, and feels both comforted and condemned. In the morning she will smile for the world, issue orders and sign letters with a steady hand. But here, alone, Evelyn Ashford whispers the same prayer again and again, that the truth will stay buried, that no one will ever see the likeness in the boy's grey eyes. Outside, the frozen fields wait for spring, for labour, for life to begin again. But beneath that stillness, something darker is already taking root. A secret growing in the house at Willow Creek, a secret that will not remain hidden forever. By the time the frost lifted that spring, the Ashford name had already begun to fade. Merchants in Richmond stopped extending credit. Neighbours whispered that the young widow could not manage her affairs without a man's guidance. Evelyn read every rumour in the careful handwriting of the letters that arrived each week, pity disguised as advice. She answered none of them. Each morning she crossed the veranda before sunrise, the hem of her black gown brushing against the thin layer of dew that silvered the floorboards. The fields beyond were ghostly in the half-light, the cotton stalks bare and brittle from the winter cold. Somewhere out there came the dull rhythm of a hoe striking earth, a reminder of work continuing without her command. She should have felt comforted by that sound. Instead, it filled her with unease. The world that had once obeyed her husband's voice now seemed to move according to rules she could no longer read. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and lamp oil. She had dismissed most of the household staff to save money. Their absence left the corridors hollow. When she passed the closed nursery door, she slowed her steps but never stopped. Habit, fear, and love pulled in opposite directions, and the tension between them hollowed her out more effectively than grief ever could. At noon she would sit at her husband's desk, beneath the portrait of his ancestors, and sort through ledgers she barely understood. The figures blurred together, columns of debt, lists of supplies, the endless arithmetic of survival. Once she thought she heard his voice behind her, low and impatient. "You were born for company, not for command." She turned, and of course there was no one there. Only the pale light filtering through gauze curtains and the portrait's painted eyes following her across the room. In the evenings, Evelyn forced herself to perform the rituals expected of a woman of her standing. She lit candles in the front windows, so travellers on the river road would see that Willow Creek still stood. She wrote thank-you notes to neighbours who never visited. The performance was exhausting, but it was also armour. If she could make the house look alive, perhaps the truth inside it would stay asleep. The spring wind carried the scent of thawing earth and wood smoke. Each night it slipped through the cracks of the old house and stirred the curtains like restless hands. Evelyn would wake before dawn, certain she had heard a voice calling her name, soft and familiar, somewhere deep within the walls. She would rise, strike a match, and walk the hall until the sound faded. Only then would she return to bed, whispering the same promise she made every morning. No one would ever know. The days grew longer, but the house at Willow Creek seemed to darken all the same. Sunlight reached the windows only to slide away, leaving faint patterns on the plaster like fingerprints. Evelyn often thought the light itself avoided her. Letters kept coming. Some asked after her health, others inquired politely about the estate. She stacked them on the hall table, unopened, until they became a small monument to everything she wished to ignore. When visitors did arrive, a cousin from Richmond, a neighbouring planter's wife, they stayed only long enough to remark on the chill in the corridors and the silence of the place. They never stayed past sundown. At night, the silence was no longer empty. The timbers creaked with the slow breath of the house, and sometimes, under the weight of wind and memory, Evelyn imagined she heard whispering behind the panelling. It was never words, only a thread of sound, half sigh, half lullaby, that rose and fell with the weather. She would stand barefoot in the hallway, candle held high, the flame trembling as though the air itself were alive. Nothing waited there. Still, she listened. In the kitchen wing, a handful of workers remained, people who had known the Ashfords for generations and who spoke of the mistress with the cautious respect one gives a sleeping storm. When they passed her in the yard, they lowered their eyes. Evelyn told herself it was proper, but sometimes she wondered if they were afraid for her, rather than of her. One afternoon she heard two of them murmuring near the well. Their voices carried just enough to reach the veranda, a tale about a child's laughter echoing in the nursery, though no child lived in the house. She stepped outside before they could finish the sentence. Both went silent, their faces shuttered. "The wind plays tricks in these hollows," she said evenly, though her pulse thudded in her throat. They nodded, but the way they looked past her toward the shuttered windows above told her the story had already taken root. That evening she locked the nursery door again, turning the key twice. Then she sat on the floor of the parlour, back against the cold hearth, and listened. The house settled with soft groans. From somewhere deep within its bones came a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. She pressed her palms to her ears and whispered, "Hush now. Please, hush." The whisper stopped, or perhaps it simply moved deeper into the walls. When she finally rose, her knees ached, and her candle had burned to a stub. Upstairs the locked door waited, patient and silent. Evelyn touched the key at her waist as though it were a charm against ghosts, and promised herself that tomorrow she would sleep through the night. But the promise felt as fragile as ash in her mouth. By midsummer, the air in Virginia thickened until even the river seemed to stand still. At Willow Creek, every sound carried, the rasp of insects, the slow creak of porch boards, the thud of a hammer somewhere out in the sheds. Evelyn Ashford could feel the season pressing on her like a fever. That was when Mr. Pike returned. He had managed her late husband's fields before the war clouds gathered. A square-shouldered man with a voice like gravel and a habit of looking at people too long. The neighbouring families had recommended him again. A steady hand, they said, and Evelyn, exhausted by accounts and repo, agreed before remembering why she had dismissed him years earlier. He arrived at dawn, hat in hand, boots still wet with dew. She greeted him on the veranda, polite but distant. He studied her as if cataloguing the cracks time had drawn across her face. "Place looks smaller than I recall," he said. "Most things do when they're dying," she replied. The words escaped before she could stop them. For the first few weeks, Pike kept his distance, though she felt his presence everywhere, his boots on the gravel path, his tobacco smoke drifting through open windows. He brought order to the fields, but with order came his watchful gaze. He asked questions she did not want answered, about the books, the help, the empty rooms. Sometimes she caught him glancing toward the upper floor where the nursery door remained closed. One humid evening, as the sun bled out behind the magnolias, Pike lingered on the veranda after reporting the week's numbers. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "there's talk again. Something about a room you keep locked. I tell them folks ought not concern themselves with the mistress's business, but, well, talk has legs." Evelyn set down her ledger carefully. The air smelled of rain that never came. "Do you believe everything you hear, Mr. Pike?" "Not everything," he said, "but I've learned that silence means there's something worth hearing." For a moment, neither of them moved. The world beyond the veranda was a wall of cicadas. Evelyn felt the weight of the key at her waist, and knew he had noticed. "I keep that door locked because memory has a scent," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's best to shut it away." Pike nodded once, but his eyes held hers a beat too long before he touched his brim and turned down the steps. When he disappeared into the dark, she realized her hands were shaking. She closed the ledger, bolted the front door, and leaned against it until the tremor passed. Upstairs, the floorboards gave a soft sigh, as though the house itself had overheard them both. Evelyn lifted her candle, watching the shadows tremble across the wallpaper, and whispered into the empty hall, "He's looking now." The house said nothing back, but the stillness had changed. Some secrets, she thought, could feel when someone's eyes had found their edge. August brought the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the ground, and turns thought itself into labor. The house at Willow Creek slept through the afternoons, windows shuttered, curtains drawn against the glare. Only the kitchen kept its rhythm, knives tapping, kettles sighing, the muffled sound of bread being kneaded on a floured table. Evelyn often paused in the doorway to watch the quiet choreography of it all. The cook, old Martha, moved slower now, her hands thick with arthritis. Beside her, a thin boy worked silently, reaching for bowls before she asked, carrying wood to the stove, setting plates in perfect order. He couldn't have been more than 12, maybe 13. The sleeves of his shirt were too short. The cuffs ended above two. He longbones of his wrists. She told herself she studied him because of his efficiency, how naturally he fit into the house's machinery. But there was more to it. Something about the slope of his shoulders, the grey cast of his eyes. When he turned toward the light that fell through the high window, the likeness struck her so sharply that she had to look away. Martha noticed her once in the doorway and dipped her head, uncertain whether to acknowledge her mistress or pretend she hadn't seen her. "Fine boy," she murmured, as Evelyn retreated up the hall. The words carried an innocence that twisted in Evelyn's chest. That evening, she found herself seated at her husband's old desk, a blank page before her, quill poised. She meant to write instructions about supplies or repairs, something practical, but her hand moved of its own accord. He grows taller every week. The ink spread slowly into the paper, as though reluctant to reveal the thought. She blotted it out, but the ghost of the sentence remained. Outside, the last light of day pressed against the horizon. The frogs had begun their steady chanting from the riverbanks, a sound like the earth breathing in its sleep. From the kitchen wing drifted the faint smell of cornbread and smoke. She imagined the boy there, washing the last dishes, the lamplight turning the water gold. A simple scene, harmless. Yet it filled her with a sadness so deep it felt like nostalgia for something that had never been allowed to exist. Later, as she passed the kitchen door, she heard laughter, brief, surprised, like the bark of a fox. It startled her. The sound of joy had grown rare in that house. She almost stepped inside, but stopped herself. To be seen watching would invite questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she stood in the dark hall until the laughter faded, leaving only the hiss of the stove and the steady heartbeat of her own regret. When she finally turned away, the boy's shadow moved across the window, a narrow silhouette framed in firelight. For an instant, it seemed the house itself was looking back at her. By early autumn, the fields yellowed, and the air carried the first trace of wood smoke from the hills. On the surface, Willow Creek seemed calm again. Wagons creaked along the road, the chimneys breathed thin white plumes, and the front veranda was swept each morning until the floorboards shone. From a distance, a traveller might have thought the estate prosperous, untouched by rumour or ruin. Evelyn Ashford understood that illusion was its own kind of currency. She spent her days preserving it piece by piece, letters answered in a graceful hand, accounts written in tidy columns, flowers placed in the hallway vases, though no guests came to see them. She moved through the house as a curator of respectability, arranging her life into still life perfection. When the Reverend Whitaker's wife called one afternoon, Evelyn received her in the parlour with tea poured exactly at the boil. They spoke of weather, of the governor's health, of a neighbour's daughter newly engaged. The conversation floated above the darker currents that both women could sense, but would never name. At last the visitor smiled too brightly and said, "It must be lonely here, with the colonel gone." Evelyn's teacup clinked against the saucer. "One grows used to quiet," she said, and that ended it. After the carriage rolled away, she walked through every room and straightened whatever had shifted. A curtain edge, a misplaced book, a candle not perfectly scented. Order was the only proof she had left that she still commanded something. Yet beneath the calm, she could feel the thin places widening. Servants who spoke in softer tones when she entered, neighbours who wrote but did not visit, the overseer's reports growing shorter and more guarded. Each evening she lit the lamps herself, one by one, until the house glowed like a ship at anchor. The light looked steady from the road, but inside it trembled with every gust of wind. Sometimes she paused on the staircase, listening for the hum of conversation that used to fill these rooms. The silence that answered felt heavier than noise could ever be. That night she dined alone at the long table set for two. The silver gleamed, the clock ticked precisely. The empty chair across from her remained an accusation. Through the open window came a faint echo from the kitchen. Voices, the soft clatter of plates, a laugh quickly hushed. For an instant she envied the simplicity of that sound, the way life continued beyond the reach of her composure. She folded her napkin with deliberate care and rose. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would invite company. She would fill the house with light and laughter until even the walls forgot the truth. But as she crossed the hall, a gust of wind extinguished the nearest lamp, leaving the corridor half dark. She stood there for a moment, the scent of smoke in the air, realizing how easily a single breath could undo everything she had tried to keep intact. Morning returned with a thin grey light that flattened every colour it touched. Evelyn sat at her desk before the fire had caught, sleeves rolled above her wrists, trying to read figures that refused to make sense. The ledgers smelled faintly of mildew. The ink in the well had thickened overnight. She dipped the pen anyway and wrote her husband's name at the top of a page, as though invoking him might keep the numbers from unravelling. In the courtyard below, the first sounds of the day began. Buckets drawn from the well, a gate creaking open, the steady rhythm of footsteps crossing gravel. She heard a boy's voice, low, half singing, and the faint reply of an older woman. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine it was any ordinary household, the sort of morning she could describe in a letter without hesitation. Then the voice carried a word she did not recognize, something that sounded like a question. The sound drifted through the open window and settled inside her like a pebble dropped in water. Later, when she passed through the hallway hours, she found the boy crouched by the door to the library, chalk in hand. He had drawn letters on the slate she used for household lists, uneven, uncertain, but unmistakably words. He looked up, startled, as if caught in a crime. The chalk rolled from his fingers. Evelyn stood still, her mind a tangle of instinct and fear. To correct him would be to acknowledge what he was learning. To praise him would invite questions she could not answer. "Who taught you that?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "No one, ma'am. I just saw the shapes." The answer was too simple, and that simplicity cut deeper than defiance. She wanted to tell him that curiosity was dangerous, that knowledge could unmake the fragile order of their lives. Instead, she said, "Put the slate back where it belongs." Her tone came out sharper than she intended. The boy obeyed, eyes downcast, and slipped away down the hall. When he was gone, she knelt to wipe the chalk from the slate, but faint traces of the letters remained. They seemed to glow in the half-light, pale ghosts that refused erasure. She pressed the cloth harder until the fabric tore. Only then did she stop, breathing hard, the smell of dust and chalk rising around her. That evening, the sound of the boy's voice came again from the courtyard, quieter now, cautious. Evelyn stood at the window, watching the shadows stretch across the yard. The lesson she had meant to teach him was obedience, but what lingered instead was silence. His, hers, the house's. It filled the spaces between heartbeats until she wondered which of them had truly been corrected. Outside, the last light faded behind the trees. In its absence, the walls of Willow Creek seemed to lean closer, as though listening for the next word that neither of them dared to speak. Sunday arrived clear and heavy with heat. The air itself seemed to hum, carrying the scent of pine sap and river mud from miles away. Evelyn dressed carefully, fastening the last button of her black gown with the precision of a ritual. The carriage waited in the yard, horses stamping against flies, and she stepped inside with her gloves folded tight in her lap. The church sat on a hill above the river, a small white building whose paint was already flaking, its bell a shade off-key. She had not attended for weeks, and when she entered the doorway, the congregation turned in a slow ripple of acknowledgement, polite nods that never reached their eyes. She held her chin high and moved toward the front pew. Father Whitaker began his sermon in the steady, deliberate voice that had comforted generations. His words wound through familiar passages. Humility, the wages of deceit, the difference between confession and exposure. Evelyn tried to listen, but each phrase seemed to land too close to her own thoughts. When he read aloud, "There is nothing covered that shall not be revealed," she felt the air in the church thin around her. After the benediction, she waited until most of the congregation had drifted down the steps before approaching him. The old man smiled when he saw her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "It's good to see you back, Mrs. Ashford. The pew looked too empty without you." "I've been occupied with the estate," she said. He nodded. "A house is easier to mend than a conscience." Then softer. "You've lost much. Grief can turn even honest hearts inward." His kindness made her uneasy. "You speak as if you know mine." He studied her a long moment before replying. "Every soul carries its own silence, Mrs. Ashford. But silence has weight. It leaves a mark on the face, on the voice. If there's something you've bound too tightly, be careful. The rope cuts both ways." She thanked him and left before he could say more. Outside, sunlight struck the river until it looked like a sheet of molten glass. The sound of the bell followed her down the road, each toll a heartbeat fading into distance. Back at Willow Creek, she walked through the doorway and felt the familiar hush fold around her like a cloak. The rooms were as she had left them, precise, orderly, waiting. Yet the preacher's words clung to her. That night she found herself at the writing desk again, opening the journal she had promised never to touch. The ink glistened in the candlelight as she wrote, "Some truths cannot be spoken aloud, yet they speak through everything I touch." When she closed the book, the wind shifted, carrying the echo of the church bell across the fields. It seemed to pulse through the walls themselves, a slow reminder that secrecy and salvation often wear the same face until one of them decides to break. The rain began without warning, thin needles falling through late summer heat. By dusk, the roof gutters overflowed, and the air inside Willow Creek tasted of rust and damp wood. Evelyn stood at the parlour window, watching the fields blur into a grey wash. The weather felt like reprieve. When it rained, no one came calling. Yet gossip has its own kind of weather, and it travels farther than storms. A letter arrived the next morning from her cousin in Richmond, written in an elegant, nervous hand. "I hear strange talk from the county," it began. "They say your household has grown unusual. I know how people embellish, but perhaps it would be wise to host a dinner. Remind them of who you are." The phrasing was kind, but the meaning was plain. The world was whispering again. Evelyn folded the paper and slid it into the drawer without answering. She spent the rest of the day walking the corridors, straightening what was already straight, dusting what was already clean. At noon she stepped onto the veranda, where the boards still held the memory of last night's rain. Across the yard, she saw Pike speaking with one of the stable hands. When he noticed her, he removed his hat but did not look away. Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long. She felt the rumour solidify in that glance. Something unnamed, but alive. That evening she forced herself to dine at the small table near the window, the same table where she had once taken tea with friends. She set 2 places out of habit, then removed one. The empty chair remained opposite her, a shape of absence. Beyond the glass, lightning flickered far off in the hills, a soft blue glow that quite became thunder. Later, unable to sleep, she opened her journal. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and lavender from years before. She read the earlier entries, calculations of harvests, fragments of prayers, lines she no longer remembered writing. At the bottom of one page, she had scrawled a single question. What happens when a secret grows larger than the life that hides it? She dipped the pen again, but no answer came. Downstairs, a shutter banged in the wind. She descended with a candle and secured it, but when she turned back, she thought she heard a voice in the hall. Her name, barely a breath. The flame wavered. "Who's there?" she whispered, though she knew better than to expect a reply. Only the echo of her own words returned, thin as the rain outside. When she finally climbed back to her room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The candlelight cut her face into halves, one pale and composed, the other flickering with shadow. She realized, with a small shock, that this was how the county must see her now. Half truth, half spectre, a woman both present and already fading into legend. The storm that had lingered for days finally passed, leaving the world rinsed clean. Mist rose from the river at dawn and drifted through the orchard, softening every edge. Evelyn watched it from her window and thought the land looked almost merciful, as if it had forgiven the summer for its cruelty. Then a figure moved among the pear trees, small, deliberate, balancing a basket on one hip. She recognized the boy by his gait before the light touched his face. He had grown taller. It startled her each time she noticed, as though time itself were conspiring against secrecy. When he paused to wipe his brow, the gesture carried something unfamiliar. Assurance, or perhaps simply awareness. The child who had once moved like a shadow now looked straight ahead, unafraid of being seen. In the kitchen later, she heard him speaking quietly to old Martha, asking questions about things beyond the estate, towns upriver, the railroad, the names on passing mail coaches. His voice was low but steady. Evelyn lingered in the doorway until Martha spotted her and fell silent. The boy glanced over, half curious, half wary. She wanted to tell him to continue, that curiosity was not a crime, but the words stuck in her throat. She only said, "Mind the fire," and turned away. That evening, as she crossed the yard, she found him by the stables, sketching in the dirt with a broken stick. He looked up, startled, and brushed the marks away with his boot. But she had already seen them. Lines forming letters, words he had written from memory. The neatness of them made her chest tighten. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "I just watched how you write orders, ma'am." The answer was disarming in its honesty. For a moment she could almost hear the echo of her own younger self, hungry for meaning. She should have corrected him, warned him about boundaries. Instead she stood, in silence, the night gathering around them like a tide. The lamps from the house threw long shadows across the yard, and in one brief flash of recognition she saw the resemblance between them, the same grey eyes catching the same light. She turned before he could notice her expression. "Go on inside," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It'll be dark soon." He obeyed, leaving his stick behind in the dust. When she looked down, the faint lines of his writing remained, blurred but legible. She knelt and traced them with her fingertip, until the words dissolved into the soil. Above the treetops, a single bell from the church far downriver tolled once, twice, before falling silent. She waited until the echo faded, then whispered to the empty yard, "It's begun." The heat returned, as if the storm had been nothing more than a brief trick of light. By late afternoon the air shimmered above the fields, and even the cicadas seemed to rasp more slowly. Evelyn sat at her husband's desk, the ledgers spread before her, the smell of wax and dust filling the room. Numbers blurred into each other. The columns of debt no longer frightened her. They simply dulled her. A knock came at the door. Mr. Pike entered without waiting for a reply, hat in hand. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said, "but a trader from Petersburg rode through this morning. He's buying labour for the new line north of the river. Says he'll pay in cash, fair rates for the season." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the ledger. "And what has that to do with me?" "He asked after certain hands," Pike said carefully. "The boy in the kitchen among them. Claims he's got the strength for it." A pause stretched between them, long enough for the clock on the mantel to count 4 deliberate seconds. "You may tell him," she said at last, "that Willow Creek is not in the habit of selling its people for convenience." Pike inclined his head. "As you wish. Though, truth be told, a bit of coin might ease things here." He glanced around the room, his gaze landing on the stack of unpaid invoices. "Your bleeding silver, Mrs. Ashford. Sometimes a small loss spares a larger one." When he was gone, Evelyn closed the ledger and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. Outside, the world looked blurred and infinite. She imagined it swallowing her whole, and felt, for an instant, the strange peace of vanishing. That evening, she found the boy near the well, carrying buckets of water that were nearly too heavy for his frame. The sunset burned red behind him, turning his outline to shadow. "You can leave them," she said. "The rest can wait until morning." He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Pike says there's work up north, building a railroad. Do you think they'd take someone like me?" She caught her breath. His tone was neither pleading nor defiant, just curious, as if the world beyond the horizon were no longer a rumour, but a destination. "The world doesn't always take us where we wish to go," she said. The answer felt hollow even as she spoke it. He smiled slightly, polite, and carried the buckets toward the kitchen. Evelyn watched until he disappeared through the doorway. Then she turned back to the fields. The first stars were already out, scattered across the bruised sky. Somewhere beyond them waited the choice she would have to make, the one that would cost her everything she had tried to protect. That night she sat in the dark parlour and whispered the words she had written months ago, tracing them in memory. Some truths cannot be spoken aloud. She wondered if silence could also be a kind of betrayal. The next morning came thin and pale, the kind of dawn that seems unsure whether to begin. Evelyn woke before the first bell from the river town, and knew, without being told, that the day had already decided itself. The air smelled of dust and iron. Somewhere in the yard a horse stamped and blew, a stranger's horse. When she stepped onto the veranda, Mr. Pike was waiting beside a wagon. Two men she didn't know stood behind it, speaking in low voices. One of them tipped his hat. "We were told to come for a boy, the one fit for rail work." The words were polite, but they left no space for refusal. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She wanted to tell them to turn back, to say there had been a mistake. Instead, she heard her own voice answering calmly, almost distantly, as though someone else was speaking through her. "He'll be ready." Inside the house, the kitchen had fallen silent. Old Martha stood at the table, her hands resting on a folded cloth bundle. The boy looked from her to Evelyn, uncertain but not afraid. He seemed older in that moment, older than she had ever allowed him to be. "Is it true?" he asked. She could not bring herself to lie, so she only nodded. Martha pressed the bundle into his hands. "Bread and dried apples," she murmured. Then, to Evelyn, a look that was neither pleading nor forgiving, merely knowing. Outside, the wagon creaked as it shifted its weight. Evelyn walked beside the boy until they reached the gate. The road beyond shimmered with heat. She wanted to tell him something, anything that might tether this instant to mercy, but language failed. He climbed onto the wagon without looking back. Only when the wheels began to turn did he raise his head. Their eyes met for the length of a breath. She could not read what he saw in her face. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. Then the moment passed, and the distance began to grow. The dust settled quickly. By the time she returned to the veranda, the sound of the wheels had vanished. She stood there until the sun burned high, until the boards beneath her feet grew hot. Somewhere inside the house, a door swung open and closed on its own. That night she wandered from room to room with a candle, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of picture frames, the cold brass of the doorknob to the nursery. Everything looked precisely as it always had, yet nothing remained the same. The stillness no longer felt protective. It felt like the echo left after a voice has finished speaking. When she finally set the ears, "Kneel down," she whispered. The only prayer she could manage. Let him find a place the world cannot ruin. The flame guttered, flared once, and went out. Autumn arrived quietly. Its light thinned and slanting, the fields brushed with the colour of rust. Without the rhythm of voices, the estate seemed to settle deeper into itself. Evelyn noticed how quickly nature reclaimed what people abandoned. Vines pressed their way up the veranda posts, rain pooled on the steps, and fine white dust crept into every corner of the house. Each morning she swept it away, and each morning it returned, soft as ash. The ledgers went unopened. Letters from town gathered on the hall table, their wax seals dull with age. When she finally broke one, it was from the merchant in Richmond, a polite reminder of her debts, followed by the phrase, "Final notice." She folded it and placed it beneath a paperweight without answering. The act of ignoring had become its own kind of order, a discipline of silence. Mr. Pike still came by, less frequently now. He spoke of repairs that could not be afforded, of crops lost to drought, of neighbours selling land to keep their names. Evelyn listened as if he were describing a story unrelated to her own. The last time he stood on her porch, hat in hand, he said, "If you ever mean to leave this place, ma'am, best do it soon." She told him there was nowhere else for her to go. He nodded, perhaps understanding, perhaps not, and rode away without farewell. Inside, the rooms grew colder. In the evenings, she lit only one lamp and carried it from parlour to library to bedroom, the circle of light shrinking with each passing day. Sometimes she thought she heard the faintest echo of laughter from the kitchen wing, though she knew it was only the memory of sound. the house remembering what it had lost. She began to keep the journal again, though the entries were little more than fragments. Weather, the cry of an owl, the smell of rain. The handwriting wavered, words breaking mid-line as if she no longer trusted them to hold their shape. On one page she wrote, "The silence has grown so large I can hear it breathing." The first frost came early. She woke one morning to find the grass silvered, the windows clouded with her own reflection. Standing there, she could almost convince herself that the figure in the glass was a visitor, someone who had come to collect her and lead her away from the house she had built around her guilt. But when she reached out, her fingers met cold pain, and the illusion broke. That evening, as the light died and the wind rose through the bare trees, Evelyn sat by the fire until only embers remained. The warmth faded from the room, but she stayed in her chair, unmoving. She thought of the boy somewhere out there in the vastness beyond the river, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to speak his name aloud. It fell into the air like a secret finally weary of being kept. Winter slipped in almost unnoticed, announced only by the thin smoke that clung to the chimneys and the sudden stillness of the river. Frost rimed the porch railings, and the magnolias wore a pale film of ice. Evelyn moved through the rooms wrapped in a shawl, the house echoing after her like an empty shell. She had stopped counting the days since the wagon left. Time had lost its edges. Then the letters began again. The fur, sent bore no return address, only a rough hand and ink that had bled from rain. A man said to be from Willow Creek was seen upriver, it read. He carries himself like no one's servant, and says he is free. The rest of the note was a scrawl of gossip and guesses, but those lines rooted in her mind and would not let go. Evelyn folded the paper carefully and slid it into her journal. She did not sleep that night. Every sound, the crack of ice in the well bucket, the wind moving through the flues, felt like a message she could almost decipher. She wondered if it was punishment or deliverance to know he had survived. A week later, a second letter came, this one from her cousin in Richmond. "Your name has surfaced in talk again," it said. "Some claim the young man working with the railroad calls himself Samuel Ashford. You might do well to correct the rumor before it stains what remains of the family." She read the line twice, then set the paper on the hearth until the flame caught the edge and curled it into smoke. The scent of burning wax filled the room. Watching it rise, she felt something within her shift. Not guilt exactly, but the slow acceptance that the world would build its own story whether she spoke or not. Outside, the road turned to mud under a steady thaw. Travellers passed less often, yet those who did sometimes paused at the gate to stare at the house. Once, when she met their eyes from the veranda, a man touched his hat and said softly, "Ma'am," as if greeting a ghost he had heard about but never expected to see. That night, Evelyn walked the corridors until her candle burned low. She paused at the window overlooking the fields and saw her reflection faintly overlaid on the dark glass. For an instant she imagined another face beside hers, young, untroubled, alive. The vision held long enough to make her reach out, fingertips brushing cold pain. Then the flame guttered, and the image was gone. She turned back toward the hall, whispering into the emptiness, "Let them tell whatever story they need." The wind carried her words away, scattering them through the cracks of the old house like seed across frozen ground. The snow returned at twilight, soft and steady, muffling the world into stillness. Evelyn sat beside the dying fire, the journal open on her lap, the ink still wet from an unfinished sentence. She had meant to write about the weather, something harmless, but her pen had stalled on the word waiting. Outside, the wind changed direction, carrying with it a hollow sound that might have been the river or a wagon on the road. A knock came just after dark. 3 slow raps against the front door, deliberate and heavy enough to tremble the glass in the windows. For a long moment she did not move. Visitors had become rare. No one came this far after sundown. When the knock sounded again, she rose, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. Through the frosted glass, she saw a shape. A man, broad-shouldered, hat in hand, snow collecting on his coat. She lifted the latch, and the cold came rushing in. "Evening, ma'am," the stranger said. His voice was low, roughened by travel.
"Forgive the hour. The bridge downriver gave out. I saw your light."
Evelyn stepped aside and gestured toward the parlour.
"You'll freeze if you stay out there."
He entered slowly, stamping snow from his boots. In the firelight she saw his face clearly. Lines carved by sun and wind, eyes an unsettled grey. Something inside her went still. For an instant she thought she knew him, but the thought passed like a shadow under water. She poured him tea from the kettle, hands trembling only slightly. He accepted it with a quiet nod, his gaze moving over the room, lingering on the portrait above the mantel. "That your husband?" "It was," she said. He studied the painting, then the room again, as if measuring the distance between past and present. "I knew a man once who spoke of this place," he said. "Said it was grand once. Said a woman kept it alive long after it should have died." Evelyn forced a smile. "People say many things." The fire popped, sending a small plume of sparks into the air. The man set down his cup. "He told me something else, too," he said softly. "Said she'd done what no one else dared. Kept her secret longer than the war itself." Her heart gave one hard beat. The room tilted slightly. "Who are you?" she asked. He held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Just a traveller," he said at last. "But I once knew someone who carried your name like a wound." The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Evelyn drew her shawl tighter, unable to look away from the stranger's eyes. The grey in them was the same shade as her own. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. The fire sank lower, and the snow fell harder, until the house and the night seemed to breathe together, each waiting for the other to make the next move. The stranger stayed seated beside the hearth, his gloves drying on the edge of the mantel. Neither of them had spoken since that first exchange. The wind had settled into a steady moan, and the snow against the windows looked like drifting smoke. Evelyn poured the last of the tea, mostly for something to do. When she set the cup before him, her hand brushed the table, and the tremor that passed through her fingers felt like memory waking up. He said quietly, "You kept this place standing alone?" "For a time," she answered. Her voice sounded to her own ears like someone else's, an echo carried down a hallway. He looked around the parlour, the cracked plaster, the portraits dulled by soot, the empty shelves. "It's strange," he murmured, "how a house remembers the people who tried to forget it." Evelyn felt the question behind the words. "You said you knew someone who carried my name," she said. He nodded once. "He told me to come back someday, not for revenge, for the truth." She felt her breath catch. "And did he find it?" "He thought he did," the man said. "But he wasn't sure if it belonged to him or to you." They sat in silence. The firelight painted both their faces in the same shifting gold. After a long time she reached for the small key that hung on a ribbon at her right. "Saint." She held it out, palm open. "Upstairs there is a room that has been locked for 20 years, she said. "If you wish to see what I kept, the key fits the last door at the end of the hall." He didn't move. "Some doors, once opened, don't close again." "That is why they must be opened only once," she said. She rose and led him to the staircase. Each step creaked under their weight, each sound swallowed by the thick air of the house. At the landing she stopped, her hand on the banister, the key cold between her fingers. She turned it slowly. The door gave a small sigh as it opened. The room smelled of cedar and dust. A single chair, a folded quilt, a narrow cradle pushed against the wall. Time had reduced everything to outlines. Evelyn crossed to the cradle and rested her hand on its edge. "I kept it because forgetting seemed worse than sin," she said. The man studied her profile, the curve of her shoulders, the grey in her hair. "He said he never hated you," he told her softly. "He only wanted to know if you ever saw him as more than what the world decided he was." Evelyn closed her eyes. "Every day," she said, "and every day I was afraid of it." The floorboards gave a single groan, as if the house itself had exhaled. Downstairs the fire had almost gone out. The stranger stepped back into the hall, leaving her standing by the cradle, hand on the past that refused to stay buried. When morning came, the snow had stopped. A pale light spread through the house, thin as breath on glass. Evelyn woke in the chair beside the cold hearth, unsure when she had fallen asleep, or whether she had slept at all. The stranger was gone. Only the faint indent of his boots remained on the rug near the door, already softening in the draught. She rose and moved through the rooms in silence. In each one she half expected to find some sign that the night before had been real. A cup left on the table, a coat thrown across a chair. There was nothing. Yet the air felt altered, lighter and heavier all at once, as if some sealed chamber inside her had been opened and left to the weather. In the study she found her journal lying open where she had left it. A single new line had been written in a hand not her own. Some doors must be opened to let the house breathe again. She traced the words with one finger, neither startled nor afraid. They felt truer than anything she might have written herself. The day moved slowly. She lit no fire, preferring the cold. It kept her awake, kept her from drifting into the easy fog that had claimed so many of her recent years. Outside, icicles clung to the eaves, catching the light like glass pendants. She stood at the window, watching them melt, drop by drop, each fall leaving a small wound in the snow below. By dusk, she could no longer ignore the exhaustion that crept over her. She carried a candle up the stairs and paused outside the door of the nursery. It was open now, the key still in the lock. Inside, the shadows gathered quietly around the cradle. She stepped across the threshold and sat on the floor beside it, the boards cold beneath her. For the first time in years, she began to speak aloud, though no one was there to hear. She spoke of things she had not allowed herself to name: fear, pride, the dull ache of remembering. The words came slowly, disjointed, but they filled the room. When her voice broke, she let it. The house seemed to listen, not with judgment, but with the patient attention of something that had waited too long to hear the truth. When the candle burned down to its stub, she rose. The air smelled faintly of wax and cedar, and for a moment she thought she caught another scent beneath it. Iron, river water, smoke. She turned toward the window and whispered, "You can rest now." She wasn't sure whether she meant the boy, the house, or herself. Outside, the snow began again, small and soundless. Each flake vanished as it touched the ground, leaving only the impression that something unseen had been forgiven. Spring crept back uncertainly, and with it came the far-off thunder that was not weather at all. From beyond the river, Evelyn sometimes heard it, an uneven rumble that made the windows quiver and set the birds to flight. At first she mistook it for storms forming over the Blue Ridge. Only when riders began passing down the road, grey coats dusted with red clay, did she understand the sky itself had turned to gunpowder. War had reached Virginia. It moved like a fever through every valley, taking whatever it touched: men, horses, iron, faith. Willow Creek stood outside the path of the first battles, but the news arrived anyway, carried in the frightened talk of travellers who begged water at the gate. Evelyn gave what she could: bread, a blanket, and listened as they spoke of towns burning, of trains overloaded with the wounded, of names erased from family Bibles overnight. Each night she marked the direction of the sounds, south one evening, east the next, until she realized the circle was closing. The river reflected the dull glow of fires from miles away. Sometimes the light reached the fields and turned the cotton stubble to the color of old copper. She stood on the veranda watching it, the air sharp with ash, thinking that the land itself had finally chosen to remember. One afternoon a patrol stopped at the house. The officer who led them was scarcely older than a boy. His saber hung too large at his side. He asked for water, for rest, for the names of the nearest crossings. When he glanced toward the shuttered upper windows, Evelyn felt the old instinct rise, to protect what was hidden, even though nothing remained to hide. She gave them directions and watched until they disappeared among the pines. When the sound of hooves faded, the silence that followed was complete, absolute. The next morning, smoke drifted over the horizon, a thin grey veil that never lifted. Evelyn moved through the house, opening every window, every door, as if surrendering the rooms to the wind. The curtains billowed inward, breathing for the house. She thought of the line left in her journal, to let the house breathe again, and wondered if this was what it meant. Not confession, but release. By evening the thunder drew closer, and the glass in the parlour trembled with each distant volley. She sat on the front stairs, P.S., hands folded in her lap, and listened. No one came to fetch her, no one to warn her. The world was breaking itself apart beyond the tree line, and she was the witness it had left behind. When the first cannon flash lit the horizon, it revealed her face briefly in the window pane, calm, almost expectant. The echo reached the house a heartbeat later, shaking dust from the rafters. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness between one strike and the next, she thought she heard a voice, quiet, familiar, saying her name as gently as if waking her from sleep. The smoke reached Willow Creek before the soldiers did. It came on a wind that smelled of resin and iron, rolling low across the fields until the sky turned the color of old parchment. By afternoon, ash began to fall, soft as snow, drifting through the open windows and settling on the floorboards. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the parlour, watching the flakes melt against her skin. They left no mark, only a faint warmth, as if the air itself were trying to remember what it once had been. When the first voices carried from the road, she did not move. The house had been waiting for this too long for her to be surprised. Boots struck the gravel, orders were shouted, sharp syllables cutting through the twilight. Then came the hollow thud of a rifle butt against the door. It gave after the second blow, swinging inward on a gust of smoke. A young man stepped through, his uniform streaked with soot, eyes searching the dim rooms. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, "you need to leave. This place is set to be cleared." Evelyn studied him, as one might study a visitor from a dream. "Cleared," she repeated, the word foreign and final. "Orders from command," he said. "Everything on this road goes tonight." She looked past him to the fields, the silhouettes of men moving with torches, the dull orange bloom of fire touching the far barns. The crackle came a moment later, soft at first, then building until it filled the air with a sound like applause. Evelyn stepped forward, the hem of her dress brushing the ashes. "There's nothing left here worth saving," she said quietly. "Do what you came to do." The soldier hesitated. "You should at least take what's yours." She shook her head. "Everything that was mine has already gone." He lingered another breath, then turned and joined the others outside. She listened to his boots fade down the steps, followed by the unmistakable whisper of flame catching wood. The scent of pine pitch rose through the halls. Curtains bloomed briefly with light before folding into embers. Evelyn moved slowly through the house, touching each surface as she passed. The smooth banister, the cold brass latch, the cracked glass of the portrait above the hearth. The paint was blistering. Her own likeness shimmered in the distortion. In that wavering image, she saw not the woman she had been, but the outline of everything she had tried to keep hidden. When she reached the study, she took her journal from the desk and held it close. The pages fluttered like a heartbeat in the rising heat. She placed it on the table, opened to the first line, and whispered, "Let the fire finish what I could not." As she stepped back, the flames climbed the walls, consuming the silence that had ruled the house for decades. And the ceiling groaned, timbers collapsing in a rush of sparks. Outside, the wind carried the glow toward the river, scattering it across the dark water until it looked as if the stars themselves had fallen to earth. At first light, the soldiers returned. The fire had done its work, leaving little more than the spine of the house, the chimneys standing like gravestones, the floor a field of blackened beams. Smoke drifted upward in thin, uncertain threads. The air still carried the sweetness of scorched pine and the acrid trace of ink. Captain Harlan dismounted at what had once been the front steps. He was a quiet man, the sort who took no pleasure in destruction, but had learned not to question it. His men fanned out, boots sinking into ash. They found a silver candlestick twisted out of shape, a charred length of lace, and near the remains of a writing desk, a small book, edges burned but spine intact. The captain brushed the soot away. The cover had once been green leather, now it was the colour of smoke. He opened it carefully. The first pages were gone, curled into black petals. But near the centre, words survived, lines written in a hand elegant and deliberate. He read aloud to the empty air. "There are truths too heavy for God to lift from the earth. So I will leave mine here, where the wind may scatter it into mercy." He turned another page. The ink had run, yet a few phrases remained legible. "I called him my servant." The sentence broke off in a wound of char. The captain frowned, uncertain what he had found. A confession, perhaps, or a kind of prayer. He closed the book and slipped it into his coat. By evening, his unit moved on. At headquarters, the journal was logged with other evidence of moral decay, its author noted as unknown. Someone stamped a date on the cover, then filed it away among letters, receipts, and fragments of ledgers taken from plantations along the river. When the war ended, the collection was transferred to an office in Washington, sealed, forgotten. Years later, a clerk sorting through boxes marked unidentified papers paused over the little book. The ink had faded almost to dust, but a few lines were still readable. He copied them into a report, misreading the name scrawled faintly across the inside cover. E. Ashford became E. Ashcroft. A single letter changed the trail, and the journal slipped quietly out of history's reach. Back in Virginia, the land at Willow Creek lay fallow. Vines climbed over the old foundation. Spring grass hid the stones that had once formed the front steps. Travellers passed without slowing, unaware of what had stood there. On still nights, the river carried the faint smell of smoke downstream, though no fires burned for miles. Some said the earth never truly forgets what it's made to hold, that the ground beneath the ashes hums faintly when the wind shifts, as if the story it once swallowed is still turning, waiting for someone to read what the fire could not erase. In the years that followed, Willow Creek became a place people spoke of only when the night was long and the fire was low. Farmers who settled nearby said their ploughs struck stones where no house had stood for decades, and on quiet mornings the river mist gathered in tiusas, the exact shape of old walls. No one could remember when the stories began, only that they returned each autumn like migrating birds that could not forget their path. They called it the widow's shame. Children dared each other to walk the road after dark, swearing they could see a single lamp burning among the trees. Some claimed to hear a woman's voice humming a tune that stopped halfway through, as though the words had been lost. Others said it wasn't a woman at all, but the wind threading through the chimney stones, repeating what it had once overheard. The locals learned to leave offerings without speaking of them. Sprigs of lavender, bits of ribbon, small bundles of wheat. No one knew why it felt necessary, only that the land seemed quieter afterward, as if soothed by acknowledgement. Preachers in the nearby towns called it superstition, but even they hesitated when the road dipped near the ruins. Decades passed. New houses rose along the river, new names filled the church registers, and still the story lingered, changing slightly with each retelling. In one version, the lady of the house had gone mad and set fire to her own estate. In another, a wandering soldier burned it to cover a crime. A few whispered of a lost journal that could prove the truth, though no one had ever seen it. The name Ashford survived, attached to a myth more than a memory. Sometimes, when travellers stopped at the inn downriver, they would mention a strange light flickering across the hills, too steady to be lightning, too brief to be a lantern. The innkeeper would nod without surprise. "The widow still keeps her vigil," he would say, polishing a glass. "She waits for someone to finish the story." Every few years, a curious soul would come searching. A historian, a journalist, a wanderer with a camera and questions. They would find the foundations overgrown, stones pressed deep into moss. Some swore they felt a vibration beneath their feet, faint as a heartbeat. One woman later wrote that she heard whispering, though she couldn't tell if it came from the wind or from the ground itself. By the turn of the century, the story had thinned into rumour, the kind told to warn rather than to remember. Yet the land remained restless. On certain nights when the moon sank low and the fog gathered along the water, even the oldest residents would pause mid-sentence, glancing toward the woods, listening for the hush that always followed her name. Nearly 60 years passed before the name returned to paper. It began with a scholar from Richmond, a quiet woman named Clara Dawson, who collected fragments of forgotten estates for the university archives. She had no interest in legends, only in documents. But history has a way of leading its seekers where rumour has already cleared a path. One winter afternoon in 1908, Clara stood in a government storeroom in Washington, dust settling in her hair, reading through a box marked Miscellaneous, Virginia, 1865. Among the letters and receipts, she found a slim book bound in smoke-dark leather. Most of the pages were gone, but on one surviving leaf, she could still make out a line written in fading ink. "I called him my servant so the world would never know he was my son." The words struck her like a bell. The handwriting. It was unmistakably feminine, controlled, careful even in despair. Clara copied the passage into her notes, marking the cover as E. Ashcroft, possibly Ashford. She left the building that evening with a faint ache behind her ribs, unable to say why the phrase would not release her. Weeks later, she took a train south to find the place itself. The locals met her questions with polite disinterest. Few admitted to knowing of Willow Creek. Fewer still would lead her to it. At last, an old man at the depot pointed upriver and said, "You'll know it when the birds stop singing." He wasn't wrong. As she climbed the narrow road, the forest fell silent, and the wind slowed as though listening. What she found there was little more than a clearing. A scatter of bricks, a hollow where the cellar had been, and half buried in the grass, a single iron key. She brushed the soil from it and held it in her palm. The weight of it seemed out of proportion to its size. Later, in her field notes, she wrote, "The land feels inhabited, not by ghosts, but by the memory of breath." Clara returned to Richmond and began piecing together what history would allow. She found records of a Colonel Ashford, dead in 1846, and a widow who managed the estate for 2 decades before its destruction. Beyond that, silence. The census listed no heirs, no surviving family, no reason the name should have vanished so completely. Yet the single line from the journal refused to fade from her mind. When her article was finally published in a small regional review, it carried a simple title: "The Widow of Willow Creek, a Note on a Lost Confession." Most readers skimmed past it, but a few paused, feeling something shift, an unease, a flicker of recognition, as though a door somewhere had opened for the first time in half a century. The legend, long dormant, had begun to stir again. Time has a way of sanding memory down until only its outline remains. More than a century has passed since Clara Dawson's discovery, yet the story of Willow Creek still flickers quietly in the corners of local lore, half history, half haunting. The river has changed its course, swallowing part of the old road, and the foundations that once marked the estate now lie beneath a thin skin of moss and wild violets. What the fire began, nature has completed with grace. Every so often, a visitor still finds their way there. Some come with cameras, some with notebooks, others with nothing more than curiosity and a willingness to walk where the maps end. They park at the edge of the modern road and follow the faint trail through the trees until the canopy opens to a small clearing. The silence there is striking. No hum of insects, no rustle of wings, just the steady sound of the river breathing nearby. One recent spring, a group of graduate students arrived to document abandoned plantation sites along the James River. They carried scanners and small ground radar units, their bright jackets oddly out of place among the grey trunks of oak. When they reached the clearing, one of them, a young historian named Mariah, noticed a slight depression in the soil, square and deliberate. Beneath a layer of roots, the scanner traced what appeared to be a cellar. And there, near the edge of the foundation, the faint glint of metal, an iron key, its bow shaped like a tear. They photographed it, bagged it, and later compared it to a drawing in one of Clara Dawson's surviving notebooks. The resemblance was exact. For a brief moment, the past felt tangible, something that could be held, catalogued, proven. But as the sun set and the woods filled with shadow, they all felt the same quiet unease, as if their presence had disturbed not a grave, but a long meditation. Back in the city, Mariah traced the Ashford name through archives newly digitized. She found fragments that Clara could not have known: deeds, shipping ledgers, a baptismal record crossed out in heavy ink. Each detail sharpened the story, yet the clearer it became, the more sorrowful it felt. In her final report she wrote, "The tragedy of Willow Creek is not one act of cruelty or shame, but the generations of silence that followed it. Today, the land is protected, marked on no tourist map. The forest continues to reclaim it inch by inch. On certain mornings, when mist rises from the river, the clearing fills with light so gentle it looks almost deliberate, like a memory exhaling. People who pass that way sometimes stop without knowing why. They describe a feeling not of fear, but of recognition, as if something once hidden has finally learned to rest." At dawn, the river mist drifts low over the valley, moving like breath across the skin of the earth. The trees along its banks lean toward one another, their reflections folding and unfolding with the current. In the clearing that was once Willow Creek, the air holds a kind of listening stillness, as if even the ground waits for a final sentence. No walls stand now, no trace of the columns that once caught the light. Only the faint pattern of stone where the foundation met the soil remains, a geometry softened by time. The key found in the roots rests in a museum drawer in Richmond, tagged and catalogued, its metal dark with age. The journal, Clara's rediscovery, Evelyn's confession, sits on the same shelf, sealed in glass to protect the paper from air. Scholars read it quietly, as though their voices might wake something that should be left dreaming. If they turn the pages slowly, they find one last entry, written in a trembling hand, the ink gone pale at the edges. "I leave this not to be forgiven, but to be understood. Let the fire take what it must, and the river carry what it cannot. If anyone should find these words, know that silence is a kind of inheritance, one I no longer wish to pass on." There are no more pages after that. The writing ends mid-line, as if the author laid down the pen and simply walked into the sound of her own story fading behind her. Outside the glass case, the world moves on, children laughing in the museum hall, the clatter of shoes on tile, the faint hum of a fluorescent light. None of them know the voice that trembles beneath the ink, or the years that folded and unfolded before the line was read again. Yet something of it lingers, a reminder that history is not only what is recorded, but what survives the attempt to erase it. Back at the river, the sun climbs higher, breaking the last of the mist. The clearing brightens. Birds return to the branches above the ruins, and their calls echo through the hollow like the beginning of a hymn. The air smells of wet earth and green shoots, the first traces of spring. Whatever haunted this place seems lighter now, diffused into sky and soil. A story finished not in flames or confession, but in the quiet persistence of memory. And so it ends, not with judgment, not even with redemption, but with release. The land keeps its silence differently now, no longer heavy, no longer ashamed, just the sound of the river moving east, carrying with it what remains of Evelyn Ashford's secret, a handful of words that have outlived every wall that tried to contain them. If this story found you tonight, let it remind you that history never truly sleeps. It waits beneath our feet, beneath our names, breathing through the silence we inherit. If you felt this story linger after the last word, take a moment, subscribe to the Macabre Record, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Because the past isn't gone, it's only waiting to be heard again.